So I just started reading Stephen King's novel, The Stand. It was published in 1978, but back then Doubleday had King cut about 400 pages from the book, thinking that it wouldn't sell if it was that long. But in 1990, he got to publish the complete and uncut version of the story, and in a preface, he explains why he felt those 400 pages were important, even though they ultimately don't change what happened. If all of the story is there, one might ask, then why bother? Isn't it indulgence after all? It better not be. If it is, then I have spent a large portion of my life wasting my time. As it happens, I think in really good stories, the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. If that were not so, the following would be a perfectly acceptable version of Hansel and Gretel. He then includes this little summary of that story, which in my opinion could even have been shorter and would have made his point better, but anyway, he concludes, I don't know what you think, but for me, that version is a loser. The story is there, but it's not elegant. It's like a Cadillac with the chrome stripped off and the paint sanded down to dull metal. It goes somewhere, but it ain't, boss. So with that in mind, Game of Thrones, Season 8. Part 1. What are the themes of Game of Thrones? Whatever your answer might have been a couple of months ago, I think it'll be hard to square it with the final season. In its rush to get to the end, the show winds up contradicting many of the themes it was trying to communicate, themes that made the show so powerful and resonant. There are a lot of reasons to be frustrated with the writing of Game of Thrones this year. And just the writing, everything else is phenomenal. While the first 2 episodes of Season 8 are a welcome return to form, focusing mainly on the characters and their relationships, the last 4 episodes speed through what should have been 3 seasons worth of story. Jorah and Theon each get fitting ends for their characters, but nearly every other character either doesn't change at all or changes too quickly. And in all cases, the central theme of each character's arc is rendered meaningless. And it's all because the writers are rushing it. It's no secret that the showrunners, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, wanted to move on to other projects. There's been talk of them making another show for HBO, and they've got a deal to go and make a new Star Wars trilogy. HBO basically gave them a blank check to make as many episodes as they needed to tell the story, and George R.R. Martin was on board for as many as 13 seasons. So it's really just these 2 guys who were anxious to end it, which, in many respects, I can understand. They've been working on an adaptation for a decade, and at some point, as a creative person, you're going to want to tell your own stories. But let someone else finish the show then? Because the story needed many more seasons to wrap everything up. And I don't agree with the argument that the show was destined to fail after they ran out of books to adapt. The show has often been more enjoyable than the novels, and the mostly solid 6th season is almost entirely about stuff that hasn't happened in the books yet. The problem is that they spent most of the 7th season moving pieces around the board without resolving any of the main story arcs. So going into that season, there were essentially 3 stories left to tell. We have to unite the living to fight the dead, we have to overthrow Cersei, and Daenerys is going to become the Mad Queen. And because none of those stories are resolved in Season 7, Season 8 has to do all of the heavy lifting. And as a result, we don't have enough time to explore the smaller conflicts on the show. We don't have enough time to look at how these events are affecting the common people, which is a central theme in the books and the early seasons. We don't have time for cleverness and schemes and nuance. We don't have time for character development. We just don't have time. And as a result, many of the themes of the story fall by the wayside. Part 2. The cost of subverting expectations. So here's a question. What's the dramatic benefit of subverting your audience's expectations in a story? That phrase gets tossed around a lot, but what does subverting expectations even mean? Well, first of all, subversion is different from simple surprise. Surprise can be totally random. But subversion actually has to be motivated. It has to play on a well-known trope as a way of commenting on that trope's existence. Here's what I mean. When Ned Stark dies, it subverts our expectations that the protagonist would overcome all odds and survive. Instead, he's killed, and the message couldn't be clearer. In this story, no one is safe. Characters will face the logical consequences of their decisions. Ned's death, or the Red Wedding, play on our expectations built up by other pieces of media, where characters miraculously survive things all the time. And this is all crucial to the themes of the story. Being honorable is not enough. Having a just cause is not enough. You need to be clever to survive in this world. But a side effect of the story's great subversive moments is that it created a lot of buzz for the show. Game of Thrones was a conversation piece because it was shocking, and that helped build the audience. But I think the writers took the wrong lesson from this. They started to think we only wanted big shocking twists or big epic battles, and the impulse to deliver on that infected the writing. And so we end up with big surprising moments that aren't exactly meaningful. I mean, what trope is this moment calling into question? Well, in fantasy stories, we often see the hero and the villain of a story fight to the death. So we're expecting Jon to be the one to kill the Night King.
The Night King turns and sees Jon coming for him. Is this going to be an epic fight? No. The Night King...
But then, surprise! Arya's the one to do it. Except we already knew that Arya was an incredible assassin who was capable of this. The trope the writers want to undermine is the idea of there being a chosen one who will defeat the Dark Lord. But they accomplish it only by making a different character the chosen one. So what's the commentary there? It would actually have been more subversive and meaningful if a totally random extra was the one to do it, since that would undermine the idea of needing a noble ancestry to do something great. In this case, the more traditional ending where Jon defeats the Night King would have been more satisfying than the subversive one, because it's not really subversive, it's merely surprising. But then again, thematically, it does make a certain amount of sense for it to be Arya, if there was more setup for it. Her arc has been about confronting death from the beginning, and the White Walkers are this universe's literal embodiment of death. But to make it work, the story needed to find ways to make Arya a viable answer to all of the mysteries and prophecies that it had set up about this moment. Scenes that subtly associate Arya with the imagery surrounding the prince that was promised, the salt and smoke, stone dragons, all of that. Instead, we get this flimsy scene where Melisandre repeats a line from season 3 about blue eyes as a way to foreshadow Arya being the one to do it. But it's basically asking us to ignore 99% of the clues in favor of one offhand comment. Then again, if they had foreshadowed it more, then maybe someone on Reddit would have figured it out, and then it being Arya would have been too predictable. So it would have to be someone else, but then that would be too predictable. Trying to trick your audience like this is basically like trying to win the poison game in Princess Diaries.
Now, a clever man would put the poison into his own goblet because he would know that only a great fool would reach for what he was given. I'm not a great fool, so I can clearly not choose the wine in front of you. But you must have known I was not a great fool. You would have counted on it, so I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me.
The deeper problem with this moment, though, is its impact on the overall themes of the story. George R.R. Martin has made it very clear that the White Walkers are an allegory for climate change. While everyone with power is occupied in their own petty little conflicts, the larger, more existential threat goes unanswered. The message of a story like this is supposed to be that we need to put aside our differences and our self-interest and do what is right so that everyone can survive. But that theme is undermined in two ways. First, Cersei's strategy of sitting the conflict out is completely justified by the writing. Even though she loses the final battle, she only gains power by taking no part in the fight against the Night King. But secondly, even if Jon is not going to be the one to single-handedly win the battle, then whoever strikes the final blow should only be there because of Jon. Jon is the whistleblower on this problem. He's the one rallying the troops together. So it would make sense if it was Daenerys or even Jaime who struck the final blow. If they had, then the message we'd get from the story would be, it's a good thing they all set aside their differences and worked together, otherwise that character wouldn't have been there and they would have lost. But with it being Arya, the message is, well, it's a good thing Arya wandered home. That was lucky.
All hail Bran the Broken.
The other moment that is meant to be subversive but is merely surprising and thematically confused is Bran becoming king. The first problem with this is that it makes no sense metaphorically for this scene to happen if the characters are just going to name a new king a few scenes later. So there's a bunch of Lord of the Rings references in the final episode. We've got saying goodbye at a port, sailing west, someone wrote a book about the story, and in that logic, Drogon burning the Iron Throne is the equivalent of the One Ring falling into Mount Doom. In both cases, the ultimate symbol of temptation and corruption is burned to nothing. Now, while the throne getting eviscerated doesn't literally mean kings stop existing, the visual language of the scene is communicating that idea to the audience. When you watch this, your brain thinks, so no more kings, right? This is actually a huge and recurring problem this season where you can't trust the meaning of the images you're looking at. We watch all of the Dothraki die, but then they're fine. Grey Worm seems to be making a huge decision to sacrifice the Unsullied, but then there's an endless number of them. Scorpion bolts have pinpoint accuracy until they don't. The Red Keep looks like it's collapsing in on itself, except no it doesn't. Oh, and here, Jon seems to choose to let Sam die in order to go and end the war. The visuals make it seem like this is a deliberate choice he's making that will have consequences. So even though we've seen characters imperiled throughout the episode, which is another problem, the audience is trained to see this as a death sentence. Sam should really be finished here. Except no, he survives. Okay, that was a tangent. Let's get back to Bran. Okay, so if the throne gets burned, then no one should really end up as king. But if we must pick one, I think Bran is also a bad choice for the story. The subversion here is that Jon, the long-lost heir to the throne, doesn't become king, unlike his Lord of the Rings parallel Aragorn, who does. And to be clear, I think it's the right choice for Jon to not get the throne. The idea of the long-lost heir to the throne being the only one capable of saving us is tied up with a lot of outdated ideas. But the story needed a better explanation for why he doesn't get the throne. As written, this council should be scheming to get Jon the crown, lest his children threaten the realm. But the real issue is that Sansa should definitely be queen. It makes perfect sense for her character arc, and it also makes a lot more sense for the themes of the story. This final season really elevates the idea of not wanting the throne as the best signifier of a good ruler. But if that were the case, then Ned would have been a good king too. And we know that's not true. He sat on the throne for like a day and managed to cause years of guerrilla warfare in the Riverlands. I'd argue that what the story has been trying to prove to us, again and again, is that what makes a good leader is someone who both has a strong moral code, like Ned, but who understands the political game, like Tywin or Littlefinger. And that person is Sansa. Also, having Sansa become queen helps to nullify the uncomfortable messaging of having just turned the only two female leaders in the history of this world into mad queens who are way too emotional to rule. It's just an absurd reversal to have 8 seasons of female characters chafing at the constraints society has put on them, to have them begin to escape those bonds, only to then have the story pivot to lines like this.
Yes, because he's a man, cocks are important, I'm afraid.
And her being queen in the north is really not enough on this issue. I mean, the whole point of the White Walker plotline was that we need to find a way to work together, but now secession is seen as a good thing? Now, Bran may end up on the throne in the books too, but if he does, then I hope we get a better sense of what kind of ruler he would be. Plus, the closing scene in the small council room does not inspire confidence. I mean, really? Bronn? Bronn's gonna be master of coin. Bronn. The guy who, as far as we know, still doesn't understand what a loan is?
For a man of the world, you're strangely naive.
I've never borrowed money before. I'm not clear on the rules.
And then Bran has the audacity to say that they still need a master of war?
We appear to be missing a master of whisperers, and a master of laws, and a master of war.
Like, make Bronn the master of war. He actually has experience doing that. Part 3. You're supposed to be famous for killing characters, not assassinating them. A Song of Ice and Fire is the quintessential piece of grim, dark fantasy. Author Adam Roberts has defined that subgenre as a story where nobody is honorable and might makes right. Tonally and thematically, it's the complete opposite of the worldview you encounter in something like The Lord of the Rings, where everyone is honorable and the world can be set in order by a just king. But while a sense of moral ambiguity permeates the series, it is not a completely bleak story. The characters of the story were capable of profound and positive change. And so perhaps we were fooled into thinking that it would end with a reason to believe in the goodness of humanity. For many characters, we get an ostensibly happy ending, sure, but the moral lessons from each subplot are essentially misanthropic. In Jaime and Daenerys, we had 2 characters whose lives are deeply impacted by the cynical and violent worlds into which they were born. In both cases, their stories are about rising above that violence, reforming it, building something better. And in the last couple episodes, it's all undone. Let's talk about Jaime. Jaime's struggle was to overcome his own selfishness, egotism, and violence. Its theme was that these things were possible. Despite his selfishness, he cares for innocent people, which is what makes this line so wrong-headed.
If not for yourself, if not for her, then for every one of the million people in that city, innocent or otherwise.
To be honest, I never really cared much for them. Innocent or otherwise.
Tell me if your precious Brandy commanded you to kill your own father and stand by while thousands of men, women, and children burned alive, would you have done it?
The crux of his character was that he threw away his reputation and suffered years of ridicule and mistrust because he chose to save innocent lives by breaking his oath. He's also an extremely prideful character and refuses to justify his actions in public because he hates being judged by others. But in this season, he submitted himself to judgment. He came face to face with all of the consequences of his actions, took responsibility for them, and still decided to do good, to keep his oath, to fight the dead. He's been controlled and manipulated by Cersei his entire life, but finally, after seeing how truly vile she is in the 7th season, he decides to leave her. It's taken 8 seasons to get this character to this point, and in the span of a couple scenes, it's all reversed. Now, if this is the story that we were always watching, if Jaime was always going to regress back to this and never escape his darker impulses, that's okay. But once again, we needed more reason to believe that this was the case. More reasons to believe he'd leave Brienne behind. As written, it makes it seem like this was inevitable, inescapable. In sending Jaime back to Cersei, the story is making a pretty bleak argument that we are unable to change in any meaningful way. Daenerys' story sends an even bleaker message, with an even more abrupt heel turn. From the beginning, Daenerys has been driven by 2 competing motivations. The first is her idealism, her innate sense of justice, her desire to free innocent people. The second is her desire for power, the fact that she feels entitled to rule. So to have her lust for power beat out her idealism is a perfectly logical and valid ending for the character. Except, the setup for this character turn is unnaturally forced. Daenerys is held to absurd standards by Tyrion and Varys that no one else is held to. She executed people who didn't obey her. So does everyone in this universe. She wants to attack King's Landing to take the throne. That's completely necessary. I mean, why on earth did they go halfway across the world to help her if that wasn't always in some way part of the endgame? So we have characters proclaiming that Daenerys is mad before she's done anything actually mad, and then the story tries to retroactively justify their actions with the extreme atrocities that she commits. And it all comes with some hand-wavy explanation that it was in the genes all along. Game of Thrones has always been about exploring the faults of complicated people. It's not about genetic determinism, but again, the most important point here is that the manner in which these characters are handled directly contradicts and invalidates the central themes of their stories. Daenerys wanted to change the world, free people from tyrants, but becomes a tyrant in the process. Fine. But what's the message here? That trying to improve the world is inherently misguided? The new status quo created in the wake of her conquest needed to find a way to carry that idealism through, that revolutionary spirit, to have her ideas affect the world. Creating a democracy would have broken the wheel. An oligarchy is the wheel. So here's the ultimate kicker. We thought we were watching a story about how redemption is possible even for the worst among us. About the need for us to come together during a crisis. About how by challenging social norms we can build a better world. And about how we must be savvy in the pursuit of those changes. But in the final moments, everything flips on a dime. And we find out that no, this is actually a story about redemption being impossible. That the only quality that predicts a good ruler is not wanting the job. About how it's actually better to let others solve problems instead of uniting. That women are too emotional for power. And that any attempt to improve the world will backfire. Emphasizing the subversion of expectations over satisfying storytelling and forcing unnatural changes onto other characters tarnishes so much of what this story was trying to say. And what it was trying to say was important and inspiring. A grimdark world that was trying to be a little less dark. So, in the end, the final season of Game of Thrones is like a Cadillac with the chrome stripped off and the paint sanded down to dull metal. It goes somewhere, but it ain't, boss. So Game of Thrones is a big and complicated story, but to write a story like this, you've got to remember the basics of storytelling. And according to Daniel Jose Older, those basics are character, conflict, context, and craft. And you can check out his course where he explains all of that on Skillshare. I want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this episode. If you don't know, Skillshare is an online learning community that has over 25,000 classes in writing, film production, graphic design, and more. If you want to give it a shot, the first 500 people to use the link in the description of this video will get a 2-month free trial. A premium membership will also give you unlimited access to all of their classes. As always, a big thank you to my patrons for supporting this channel. Keep writing, everyone.